Welcome to Interview with the Masters, brought to you by CGMA, the CG Master Academy. I'm your host, Ben Scott. Our guest today is Scott Robertson, artist, instructor, and founder of Design Studio Press. Look out for Scott's newest book, How to Draw, projected for release in early summer. Before we begin, a reminder that registration for CGMA courses is currently closed, but will open again on March 18th. Visit cgma2dacademy.com to view current course offerings so that you can plan on signing up for the class or classes that best fits your needs. Interview with the Masters is an ongoing series. Keep an eye on our website for more information. For everyone who is joining us today, if you have any questions for Scott, you'll see in your GoToWebinar control panel a small box titled Questions. Kindly send your questions through the control panel. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible. Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to give a short introduction about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to switch over and share some images while I talk about things that I've done in the past. Perfect. And let's launch this. So I went, let's see, technically I graduated from Art Center College of Design in 1990, so I've been out working now for quite a while. I hate to say how many years, what are we in, 13 now, 23 years ago this April when I graduated. And I've done all sorts of things. I've designed vehicles, consumer products, medical goods, theme park rides, toys, trade show exhibits, sort of everything you can imagine that sort of industrial design touches on or could be applied to. It seems like I have applied it over the last 23 years. And I started a publishing company, and it's going to be actually, we're 10 years old this March. So Design Studio Press was started back then. And, you know, I've done sort of work freelance almost my entire career. And I've also taught at Art Center College of Design for 17 years and started the entertainment design program there and ran that for several years. And now I'm sort of doing workshops out of my studio, planning a big workshop tour in Asia this summer, starting in June. And books, trying to finish 3 books. You know, we have 13 more books going to press this year, I think. So, you know, and co-producing movies and doing pitch art and a little bit of freelance. So I stay pretty busy.
To say the least.
Yeah. And I should say this little slideshow is just like random portfolio stuff I grab, and it's, you know, work in progress pieces from books, prior books, things like that. So it'll just sort of play in the background while we chat.
Now, from what we're seeing here, and I think what you're most well known for is a lot of your science fiction work, particularly vehicles, landscapes. What inspires you to make these kind of creations?
You know, I think I just, I love new and original, you know, and that's what I like to do. And really I love process more than anything. I like to go and try and figure out how to create new and original ideas. And I'm drawn to the idea of not only to see it for myself, but to show it, you know, and share it with the rest of the world, to see new and original things that nobody has ever seen before. So that's a very, you know, it's a very romantic and enticing thing to be able to do. And I really enjoy that. And so I think it's always the discovery, in pursuit of the discovery of, you know, just creating things that nobody's ever seen. And that's, it's a very fun pursuit.
Now, you've been working in the entertainment industry and doing concept design for quite a long time. How would you say that concept design has changed over the years that you've worked?
Well, you know, it's interesting because it wasn't a job option. It didn't exist actually as a job when I graduated from Art Center. So in 1990, there was some of the very first, with the exception of Sid Mead, and only a handful of illustrators and designers who had gone out and made their, you know, careers in entertainment design. It really wasn't a viable job option. And so I think what's interesting, you know, was originally it was industrial designers and illustrators, and that's still sort of the case today because of the skill sets that you need. And really the way it's changed is that now it's a viable job. You could actually go to school somewhere like Art Center and go to entertainment design class, or go to, you know, your online school or Schoolism or Concept Design Academy or Red Engine or Fang's school in Singapore. So now there are all these different ways to learn, Noman, of course, with their DVDs or their school. And so now it's a real viable career option. So I think the biggest difference is that it's just matured and that there are educational paths available for, people all over the world that want to pursue a career in entertainment design, and there's great jobs waiting. So I don't really think the film thing is it's so difficult to get into. It's only it's the same 50 people designing all the movies, so I wouldn't say that's the most viable career option. Not that you can't get there, but it takes a lot of extra effort. But definitely the game world, there's a huge need for that. And then, of course, and feature animation, whether or not it's feature or not, there's a lot of animation work to be done. And then, of course, there's this sort of side industries that are all related to entertainment, like toy design, theme park design, all of those sort of things. So I think I've just seen it mature and have, now lots of paths available for people that want to do that as a career. That's exciting.
Now we have a very broad question here from one of our attendees, and I'm not sure that you could answer it succinctly, but essentially the question is, how do we become good designers? So I don't think I'm going to lay the whole thing on you there, and I guess what I would say, the first step that you would say to take towards becoming a good designer, what would that first step be that you think you should take?
Well, the first step is, I would say, you need a healthy dose of curiosity. So I think if you are a person who's very curious, then you want to investigate and you want to pursue and you want to understand how things work. And then you're drawn to places like museums, not only art museums, but mechanical museums and science and things like that. And so I think if you first have to understand that and try to decide what is it that you like about concept design or concept art, and building a career in that. So the thing that's interesting is that I see a lot of people that think they want to be a designer, but they're really fans of video games, for instance, but they're not really fans of design. And so I think it's easy to get confused, to like all the content that a lot of designers have created, right, in the context of a franchise, and think that that's, it's hard to get past that sometimes. So I see a lot of sort of fans of the subject, and that's really all they want to do is create content for that one genre. But that's not really concept design. Concept design is more akin to industrial design as far as the process of research and defining your end user, and then designing something for that user even though they're in an imaginary universe. So I think if you're more drawn to that, regardless of the certain singular style that one franchise might have over another, then I think you have a good shot at having sort of the core, interest to pursue concept design as a career. And then once you couple that with learning that there are some definitely tried and true lateral thinking, steps to becoming a good designer, doing proper research, expanding your, visual library and how you apply that to any story. I think that's, those are the next steps educationally. But at first it's, do you have a passion for creating, original designs that either solve problems or tell a story? And then are you interested enough to then, develop your communication skills to share those ideas with, people in the world, which usually takes you right to, drawing and rendering. So I think, in a kind of roundabout way, that's how I feel about, first defining the interest and seeing if it's the proper interest in alignment with what the job is, and then pursuing it.
Now, before you were mentioning you have a great interest in process. We have a few questions along the lines of that process. And one is specifically focused on traditional hand drawing skills. Now, it's clear that you have excellent hand drawing skills, but in addition to that, you also use quite a few different processes. How has that changed the way that you draw, these new processes, and where does the by hand drawing and painting fit into that?
Yeah, it's becoming a sort of a fuzzy area now, because the 3D tools and Photoshop and that sort of thing have become so much easier to use, especially the 3D software, that you can visualize and share ideas in a photoreal nature with people without having any drawing skills. But I would say where the drawing helps the most And I'll couple that with two things. It's kind of drawing and traditional model building. So I think the two things are very intertwined, and I think if you can learn traditional drawing while at the same time building a lot of traditional models, whether they're like scale model car kits or model airplanes or things, the two really inform each other. And if you can learn the hand skills of how to build things while you're learning how to draw, your drawings take on a much more solid nature. And then when you're drawing, you're actually building models. So I think that the way I draw, and no matter what I'm drawing, is I'm always thinking about it being real, even though it's an imaginary object, and having it be solid. And so having the drawing skills, right, that I learned while building models really makes it easy to do that. And since it's going to be built, even if it's imaginary and it stays in a digital world, it's going to be built by someone. So ultimately, almost everything you do for entertainment work gets, it is 3D. So the drawing skills allow you that ability to quickly communicate changes in a model's shape or developing sections. And I think it's just the fastest, simplest way to communicate, three-dimensional model. But I think it works best if you can put the two together. If that makes some sense. And even when you're painting, ultimately it comes down to drawing ability. If you want to make a believable world and put in a horizon line and put in believable buildings, it comes back to your basic drawing skills, even though you're just maybe painting from the start.
And that actually segues great into another question we have here, and it's specifically about that 3D modeling. And the question is a little bit twofold. First is, how important do you feel 3D skills, and I think you answered a little bit of this in your previous answer, but how important do you think the digital 3D skills are to current concept artists? And then also, how can you take those 3D skills and use them to create better concepts?
I think it's becoming more and more important to 3D artists, not just because it's actually simpler to block out a scene maybe and then use your drawing skills later back over the top. I think if you have, say for instance, you have 3D only. If you have 3D skills only, then you're really tied to the computer and you're a slave to the program. You're not like you're in control of the program. It's like you have to build everything and you have to render everything and just stay within that program. But if you have drawing skills, you can just rough out a very simple part of the model and then add all the detail with your drawing and painting skills. So I think if you can use all the tools, it's the best. But I think the 3D going forward is becoming so much faster, so much simpler, that I think it's a great asset for any designer to have. Even if they don't incorporate it into the process that much, it's important that they can speak the same language when working with other model builders who are much more 3D oriented, and they're actually going to physically realize the final asset for a franchise, whether it be printed as a final model or it stays digital. I think that having some experience and being able to work in a team, which almost all good jobs and good design teams all work together. And since you're working towards creating assets, I think the ability to share those assets back and forth amongst the team is very, very valuable. So I think if you have the 3D skill set as a concept designer, it's not going to take anything away from what you have in your portfolio. It just gives you more opportunities in the job market. So I'd say, add those skill sets.
Now, in addition to process, we also have the nature of the different types of concept art: vehicles, landscapes, characters, and there are many concept artists that focus on just one. There are many that can design pretty much anything under the sun. When recommending to a person just starting out or just walking out into the industry, do you think it's better for them to specialize, or do you think it's better to try to learn a little bit of everything?
Depends how good you are, right? So if you choose to specialize, here's what happens. If you choose to specialize, now you're in competition with all the specialists. Okay, so let's say you decide you're going to specialize in just character only. And yes, there are jobs out there, but you have to be really good at that one specific genre or topic in order to land those jobs, because if you say you want to work freelance and you want to just do creature and character, when you're in competition with like Carlos Huante and Neville Page and all these amazing creature and character people, and so I think I've always suggest everybody always has their favorite thing to design, right? So it's not like you need to steer people towards their favorite. But what I think you need to do is evaluate and give yourself options entering into a career. And so I think you're always better to be a generalist, knowing that that person's always going to have their favorite thing that they excel at. So you almost don't even need to reinforce that because everybody has that thing. And so, a third of their portfolio is going to be vehicles or characters, right? Anyway, so, but if you don't pay attention to trying to understand the design process and the design methodology that allows you to design lots and lots of different subjects, then I think you run the risk of getting a job, let's say, and you start on a video game or something, and there's a lot of character work to be done. Okay, so you got a job and you start doing that. Now we've designed the hero characters, and maybe there's 10 of them or 5 of them, whatever, and it takes you several months. And we've realized, and we have our team assembled, and it's done and realized. Now that team is going to move through maybe 10 different environments, and each environment has to be fully realized. And if you can't help out to design props and design the things that address that set and those environments, now you have no more value to the team. So, what are you going to do? Well, odds are you're going to get laid off because the character work's done, and now we're moving into environments. And if you can't help, and it's not a huge company that needs lots and lots of character work, even though there's probably more work to be done on the environments, you don't have any skill sets to share and move the product forward, and that means you become a little bit obsolete. So I think a good set of core skills coupled with your favorite passion is a nice balance.
And then segueing from that question, if you are an artist that's focusing on trying to design anything that they can, how do you apply those design understandings between different types of design, understanding characters, vehicles, and environments? How do you move between those, and how do you use the rules of design between each of those so that you can understand them better in your own work?
I don't see, to me, there's no difference, to be honest. If it's entertainment work, everything's driven by the narrative, so everything's defined by the script. And whether it's a character, a vehicle, or an environment, they all have the same goal, which is to support and advance the story. So, the basic design brief is kind of the same no matter what asset you're creating. And it's sort of the same for industrial design, too. You might have obviously tighter constraints on that, on the brief, and a marketing brief. But at the end goal, you're trying to meet that brief, whatever it is. And in the industrial design world, it's a marketing brief or a sales brief, and then a product brief. And then in the entertainment world, it's going to be a script. And so I think the goal is always the same. And for me, the process is always the same. So the best way I can explain that is I just put up on my YouTube channel, I just put a video up, a recording about proximity-based styling. And in it are the steps on how I evaluate any object, whether it's a building, a character, or a vehicle. And I see them all as visual analysis of the world around you. And so you start to consider things like silhouette, proportion, stance, and the things you see first. And then you move on down the line and you have a set of priorities. And so if you break it down that way, and you start and always work towards satisfying your narrative, then they all sort of become the exact same process over and over again, but with different research on the front end. And so you might be researching, Art Nouveau aesthetics one week, and then, sort of dystopian aesthetic and ruins the next week. So this aesthetics change, but the core, if I say the core attitude or approach is always the same.
Now, if you were in a position where you were building a team of concept artists to work on a project, what qualities would you look for in the concept artists that you were hiring?
Well, it depends how much money I have to spend. So if I have a lot of money, I probably freelance the specialists okay, to get the absolute best, character person out there and the best vehicle and the best environment. But then when their phase of the project is done and they've delivered their assets, then I want a group of generalists to sort of stay on as my core team, because I know they can do anything, and maybe not to the same level. So I would probably start with the specialists, set up the aesthetic directions and themes and visual goals for the entire franchise, and then I would have a team of generalists that are great, say they're good at everything, but they're maybe not great at that one specific thing. And, we go from there and realize the entire, franchise. So it's kind of like having there's like concept design stylists and people that move from project to project, and it's because they're really great at the front end, but they don't have the interest maybe and the design detail, sort of set of skill sets that it takes to finish the entire product all the way through, because they'll get bored. And so you kind of want to, if you can afford it, you pick your specialists. If I have a really low budget, and I can only afford a couple people, I want to go with a couple people that can do a bit of everything, because I know I can actually meet the end goal of accomplishing, the task, even though I can't afford the absolute specialists. So it's kind of, it's very project dependent, and ideally it's a bit of both. But if I have a low budget, I'd go for the great all-around designer.
Now, just before we started this meeting, we had a chance, you were showing me some great images of different processes you use for inspiration and design. And I think our attendees would really enjoy seeing a little bit of what you were talking to me about there. Can we take a look at that a bit?
Yeah, I'm going to be in, looks like 14 slides. I'll switch over to that. So awesome. We have one question in the meantime. Then we'll switch to that in about a minute.
Perfect. So then I'll ask this question here. What are some of the different tools that you use? I know you use quite a bit of 3D and 2D tools. What are some of the tools that you like to use the most?
I go through phases of what I like the most, because I tend to use everything. On the 3D side, Moto is probably my favorite, but I've dabbled with ZBrush, View for doing, great skies and environments, and SketchUp even, and then, on the drawing side, digitally, Sketchbook Pro is interesting. Of course, Photoshop is my mainstay digital 2D program. And then on the drawing side, I like all mediums. I paint with gouache, draw with markers and pen, ballpoint only, tone paper with colored pencil and gouache. I mean, it's a mix of all of it. And I don't really have a favorite overall. It's like I have a favorite for the part of the process I'm in. So if that makes sense, it's like if I need to generate a lot of ideas first that are mostly color and value based, or say graphic based, I'll probably jump into Moto, build out a base model, and then do everything with texture replicators and that sort of thing to generate a lot of visual concepts very, very quickly if I just have to play with color and graphics. But if I need to generate a lot of different silhouettes quickly, I might jump onto a piece of paper with a black marker, because I can do, there's no undo and it's super fast. I'll use like a pocket brush pen, like an ink pen with a brush tip, and I can block out a lot of silhouettes very, very quickly. Whereas if I want to sculpt form, like these slides that just went by, if I want to sculpt form and transitional shapes, I probably would take my sketch and jump into Photoshop. So I'm very, very dependent, I really choose my tools for the task I'm trying to execute. And then when my tools are working nicely and the process is working nicely, then I happen to love that tool at that time. So, but I don't sort of love any one over the other. And I think in a way it kind of limits your range when you do fall in love with only one process, because each different process has, its pros and cons. I have 2 slides left, and I'll jump over to that stuff.
Excellent. So it sounds like your focus is just picking the right tool for the right job.
Exactly. And a lot of times that's a combination of tools and a combination of techniques. And a lot of times you're back and forth in and out. So you might start in 3D and then you draw from those things, and you can even print it out and draw over the top. And then you resolve some things, and then you jump back into 3D and, and go back and forth. So that, for me, there's no one way and there's no one right way. It's sort of like how does whatever helps you get there quicker. So I'm going to jump over now to those other slides. So I have this slideshow from that lecture you were just referencing, the sources of inspiration. And what was the question or the topic you wanted to talk about?
We did have someone mentioning the texture replicators and also the sci-fi suits that you do.
All right, let's start here then with sci-fi suits. So sci-fi suits are basically, I do a lot of these things with 3D replicators in Modo, and the 3D replicators are taking a small shape. I don't think my cursor will show up on screen. No. You know, a small shape or a couple of small 3D mesh forms, and then basically you just replicate them, right? Duplicate them essentially across the surface of another mesh. So in this case, the base mesh is a human body, which you can go on TurboSquid and buy one for $5, or you can get them free in ZBrush. I mean, they're all over the place. So you don't have to go spend any money to end up with a cool human body. And then I just set up zones. In this case, different zones of the body. Like the forearms have a different replicator size or scale compared to the torso, compared to the legs, compared to the helmet, but they're all the exact same piece or the same part. And like I'm specifically talking about the guy on the left, the silver suit. And then you just, by controlling the way it replicates across the surface, you can get different design directions. Because let's say you're designing a sci-fi suit. Okay, so well, the silhouette's basically going to be the same. I want this, I have a inch or two to work with all around the human body. And so that becomes the envelope you have to stay within. And you want different styles, and that really comes then down to mostly graphic design. And so these are examples of taking sort of the same, like the center suit, actually all these suits, these 3 suits, all use the exact same part. I've just changed the materials, so the colors have changed, and I've changed the way that the part replicates across that base mesh. And same with this guy. It's got, these are 3 of the same. It's actually the exact same replicator, but you'll see like the one on the left is all white. And it's something I would layer on top of the final one on the far right, for instance. Just use it as my weathering pass. Let's say he's been out running around in the snow or salt flats or something, and so it gets a lot of this white. So I would just erase that, just stack it on top. The dead center one is the straight raw render coming out of Modo. And then the one on the right, I've only gone in and started to tighten up and clean up the chest area and a little bit on the helmet, where I've added a little more, reflectivity to the visor and a specular highlight, that sort of thing. So these are some examples of that process where the base suit started as something super complex in 3D, and then I painted back over the top to make it more simple, basically. And this is really I think in a way you need to be a somewhat more mature designer or have a strong design eye to use this process, because you start super complex and you have to simplify, and that requires a lot of editing. And if you don't have a strong design eye or a strong sense of taste or aesthetic, that can be quite difficult and quite challenging to know what to keep and what to throw out. Whereas, the traditional path would be we start simple with a blank piece of paper, and then we go, more and more complex. Each level, right? You start with a base little thumbnail brush pen sketch. Then you're going to draw it with a line drawing. Then you're going to scan that line drawing, go into Photoshop. Then you're going to add value. Then eventually you're going to add color. Then you're going to add all the proper materials. Then you might jump in and build it in 3D, and then stage it, light it, render it, etc. And at the end of that process, you end up at the beginning of this process. So it's kind of bizarre. So this one starts super complex and photoreal, and then you have to simplify it by using your painting and drawing skills back over the top. So it's kind of working the exact opposite from a sort of visual editing standpoint. You're not starting simple and getting more and more and more complex. You're actually starting super complex and photoreal with all the full materials, and then you have to paint over the top, right? And then decide what to keep and what to get rid of. So here's an example of that. I think this thing will probably play on its own, I hope. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it is. So Ben, these will just play and we can talk about whatever. Perfect. Somebody else has another question.
Yeah, now a good question here is that this is a method of design, like you were saying, it starts out with a complex, But in addition to that, it's just starting out with shapes without regard necessarily to function. So what are you thinking
Correct.
about when you have all these shapes and all of this design language and you're trying to convert it into something that is actually functional?
That's where you have to sort of apply your industrial design skills and your sort of human factors and ergonomics to say, okay, this figure needs to move, so they maybe need more mobility through the torso. So they may actually clean up and get rid of some of the clutter there and some of the physical difficult pieces or hard pieces, and then add some flexible areas of the suit. So I think you just go right back to the sort of thinking. The methodology is exactly the same as you would have done had you drawn it from the beginning. And this is where if you haven't already drawn and built a lot of things, using this technique can be quite daunting because you don't have that core set of foundation, product design skills, let's say, to fall back on. And that's really what you need to overlay on top of the complexity. So if I run to the next guy, you'll see that, anyone I'm done with, it's just a sci-fi suit that has all sorts of mobility problems, etc. But you'll see the decisions I make are about usually the human factors and trying to free him up to move amongst all that clutter of armor. And so I think you sort of fall back on your foundation skills, not only from a drawing and rendering standpoint, but also from a design standpoint.
I'm looking through. We have quite a few questions coming through right now. When
That's good. You like that?
It's very good. When you're creating sci-fi suits and you're creating scenes that are using this kind of model replication, what defines a good source for you to use to do the replicating function?
And I'm assuming that's the piece that I put across it?
Yes, the original piece. What do you look for in that original piece to make something interesting?
Well, here's what's interesting about this. I don't actually try to design that piece that much. And I don't actually even know what's going to make a good version of that. And here's the reason I don't worry about it, because these things render while I'm not at my computer, right? So I can be over on my drawing table sketching while my computer's doing all the work. And if it fails, no big deal. It hit, it took me a minute to hit the render button. So if it fails, I just ditch it and delete it and try something else. So it's more about trial and error than actually knowing what's going to work. And this is what's interesting about the process, is that it allows you, the labor cost to explore with this technique is so low because you can have your computer do it overnight, the rendering part of it, that it's really all about experimentation. And I've been really, I get sometimes frustrated because you want as a designer to know what's going to work, right? And you think as a designer with a lot of experience, you should be able to design this really bitchin' part that's going to say, oh, that's the like special sauce, right? That's the one that when I put it on this 3D mesh, it's going to give me the magic. And I've tried to do that, and I have been frustrated several times to see that the one I spend a lot of time designing and then I replicate across the suit gives me an awful result. And so I'm like, well, let's just try this piece, right? I go grab something out of a library or off of another model I'd already done, and I just throw it on there as a test. And I'm shocked several times. It's like, wow, that's pretty cool. And so, you kind of start to get a feel for what works and what doesn't, but at a certain point, you don't have to worry about it because you just hit render and let it run overnight, and you get something cool or you don't. And if you don't, you just delete it. So, and it didn't cost you much to try and design that little part. So I don't really have a secret for it, and there's no. The secret is after, right? It's deciding which ones actually were good, and then how do you paint over the top to make it better. That's the really hard part. Getting an interesting clutter of stuff is easy to do. It's what you do with the clutter, which is where the sort of skills show through.
Now this question plays a bit to both the previous question and the one that was just asked, and it's regarding visual library. Now obviously with the concepts you're creating here, part of the visual is coming from that replicator, and the second part of that visual is coming from what you understand about design and your personal ability to paint and design. So when building a character or a suit like this, how do you bring in your visual library and combine it with what's already there to create a final piece?
I think what happens is you, during the painting or during the editing process, you call upon your experience and how deep is your visual library, how many images are in there and how many shapes have you already drawn and painted before. And what you try to call upon is this sort of finding the rhythms and the harmony amongst the shapes. And I wouldn't say this is a great example of it at all. I mean, this is just something I did in an afternoon, and it's fairly unresolved. But that's kind of what you're starting to think about and do is, the more experience you have, the more things you've seen, the more things you've drawn and painted in your past, the easier it is for you to quickly take a cluster of parts, for instance, and then find the harmony and find the associated balance of all of those parts together. And so I think the richer your visual library is, the easier that process becomes. And that's why I say that I think this process works best, this level of abstraction works best for designers that have a bit more experience.
So when you're building that visual library, what do you do, and what are some things that our attendees can do to make their visual library more rich?
Well, I just put up a good 3-part lecture on that, again, on my YouTube channel, and I wish I had those slides here, but I don't think I do on this computer. But I think that, there's a couple of really simple research things you can do. Obviously, I use a lot of photography, not only in my work that I go out and shoot myself, but also in exploring and researching. And so I think, the simple things are, if you have an interest in vehicles, you go to car shows, you go to racing events, etc., and you start to get in there and learn more about the things you're going to try to do a future or a new version of. So it's kind of like anatomy trip in a way, right? You're going to the museum and you're learning all about the dinosaurs and their skeletons and their musculature and that sort of thing. You can learn the base anatomy of any object, whether it's a building or an animal or a vehicle. And so I think there's that sort of core, and that's why I say that when I mentioned curiosity at the beginning of our talk, I think you have to have that curiosity. And if you don't have the curiosity, it becomes tough for you ever to become a visual expert on any one subject. Because you kind of need that deep dive into that subject to build that the visual library you need to then recombine those things you've learned about that object into interesting new versions. So I think the base things to build, obviously reading, traveling, going to museums, go to any event that has, like-minded people at it, whether it's a racing event or car show, art show, right? Talk to other people, exchange ideas with them, and that all helps to richen at least the first step, which is the experience and getting the visual exposure. And of course, you can do it online as well. If you're limited and you can't travel a lot, then that's fine, but it never really sticks in your visual library until you draw it. So if you really want it to come back out your hand in the things you're drawing and designing, whether you're painting in Photoshop or even 3D modeling, then you have to input it, okay? And you can't just do it by looking at it and expecting it to come out your hand. You've actually got to input it through your hand to get it to come back out. And so if you really want to learn something, observing it, because when you start to draw something from reality, your observation skills get turned up a notch when you're trying to capture the thing that's right in front of you and you're doing it via drawing. And you're also building muscle memory for the shapes that you're observing. So the likelihood of those shapes coming back out again goes way up versus you just looking quickly at a photograph online or something like that. So I think those are all good ways to get started.
And this is a final question about the suits. When you're doing a design like this, when do you know that you've done all that you can do and you're finished with the design?
When you're out of time. So, there's no done, right? There's no finished. The book has to go to press, or we're out of time, we're out of money, and this is what we've got. Let's hope it works. Okay, so you do the best you can with the time and money you have. And I think it's important also for people to especially young designers and even old designers, to realize and try to understand the process and the time frame that the designers created those things that they're admiring or observing. Because when you look at, say I look at some sketches and they're in a, let's say they're in an art of book for a movie, right? And I look at the work and I'm like, you know, it's not that illustrative, or maybe the ideas are that fantastic. And so you discount the work thinking it's not that great. And then you realize, and if you actually read the text, oh, we were given an afternoon, you know, to come up with these concepts. And then once you you know, frame it in a new perspective, you know, no pun intended, looking at the drawings, you start to appreciate it much more. And so I think it's always important to try and learn as much as you can about the process and how the things in the studio were created and what sort of time frame they were done in, because it takes on a new light if you look at some work and you know somebody only had an afternoon to, one, come up with the idea, two, do the styling and draw and paint the thing and present it. And then it's like, wow, that's really impressive. And I was originally going to discount the quality of that artwork, but now I find that artwork quite impressive because of the time frame, or, you know, the conditions it was executed under. So I think it's important to realize that, and it can help you appreciate something that you might have discounted, and it also gives you a deeper understanding of the things you'll be up against in the future when you know you're out of time and money and the thing just basically has to be done. So, but with design and styling, it's infinite, right? Because you can just keep going and going. So I think if that's clear, it's a bit rambling.
It's perfectly clear. It's perfectly clear. We do have some attendees that are interested in seeing some designs that you've done with cars, and you were showing me an excellent technique you were using to create some very interesting vehicles.
I'm trying to remember which one that was. This is all from that inspirational talk on my YouTube channel. So there's 375 slides in here. Let me just show some sort of interesting vehicles. Well, this is one of the latest things that I've been working on. And let's see if you're a traditional car designer. This thing's called brush warp render. And what it is, it's a way for you to stay true to the hard points of your package, right? The hard points are like where the wheels are, the size of the wheels, the wheelbase, and the package is right where the engine is, the people, the cargo, etc. And so when you're designing traditional cars, that has to stay fixed, and you sort of know the package going in a lot of times. But you maybe have some muscle memory, and so this was an attempt to try and break out of the muscle memory you might have from drawing the same shapes for years and years. And what I do is I take like a graphic brush in Photoshop and just click it once or twice and then warp it across those hard points. So if you look to the front of this car, I would say is the only part that's kind of getting interesting on this, you know, first attempt. And, you know, there's maybe shapes that are wrapping around that front wheel that I wouldn't normally have drawn. And so I think that can be an interesting way, if taken further, right, to develop. These are some of the custom brushes I would use for doing automotive type of vehicle forms. But vehicles, for me, are so much about the package and the hard points. That's almost always how I start. So it's always about drawing the wheels, the package where the people go, the engine, that sort of thing. And then to come up with an interesting skin over all that stuff. Oh, right, maybe this kind of thing. You could, if it's in 3D, you could actually take some maps, like these are some maps that I would wrap over a simple form. So I just made these with some custom brushes in Photoshop, and then I would project them onto a really, like this is a simple spaceship form, but all those graphic lines and the perforations in there and the translucency that you're seeing through these multiple skins is coming from those maps out of Photoshop. And that's stuff that I probably would not have drawn. So I think that can be a really interesting way. And it's the exact same sort of thing I was doing with the texture replicators for the suits, which is not the stuff I was just talking about. Texture replicators are totally different than 3D replicators. Same idea, but with images instead of 3D mesh parts. So these are things that might drive me into different directions. It's just sort of like a loose, you know, sort of assembly of parts, and then with a skin over the top. And so for any interesting cut lines and perforations, and this is ready to go back into Photoshop and then paint back over the top of it, or do a motion blur, whatever. But this hasn't even been painted over. It's just that straight render, and just did a quick motion blur, and it's done. At least it's a quick concept. So hope that makes sense.
Certainly does. Now, for designs like vehicles, whether they're futuristic or they're modern day, what are some best places to find reference and to do research that can better inform your vehicle designs?
Well, I think if you want to get into real vehicles, even if they're sci-fi vehicles, I think one of the best places is one of our authors, Stuart Macy, put out a great book called H-Point, and H-Point's all about hard points basically, and it's all the things. Even if you're designing a sci-fi vehicle, even though you could ignore a lot of this, like the small measurements and things, the core concept of packaging, which that's a textbook all about packaging, that core concept of arranging functional elements, right, that need to support the performance of an object, whether it be a chair or a weapon or a vehicle, doesn't really matter. But it's that ability to first understand that, okay, these things have a relationship in the package. They have to be associated in a certain way. Then I have freedom to connect and skin those things. And so what I like to do to create original vehicles is to move those things around. So play with putting, the engine in the back versus the front, and so, or wheel size, etc. And so I just saw this little slide here. So this guy is, for instance, just grab some wheels, okay, out of my database of wheels. And I think actually this thing I even grabbed out of SketchUp because it's so different than what I actually grabbed. What it originally was a greenhouse. And I just grabbed some of the vertex points in wireframe mode, and I just pulled and stretched and moved it around, and then I mirrored it to the other side. And as a result, I got something, very, very fast, and started just playing with the bigger styling things, so proportion, stance, silhouette, those sorts of things. And then if we liked the direction, then you would go back and either remodel it and, paint over it and finish it. So I think those are for me, it's about that proximity styling thing. So if I'm doing vehicle, package first, then that defines the silhouette, the proportion, and the stance. Those are the most important things for me, and then probably graphics after that. And then graphics mean like window shapes and things, not like literal numbers.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now you were mentioning Paintover again, and Paintover is a big part of your process when you're working with a 3D model. And one thing that's very difficult about painting over a 3D model is you're starting with something, and you mentioned this before, that already looks very real. So when you're going in to paint on top of that, how do you keep that realism while still working quickly with your Paintover?
Here I've got some Paintovers. So this is what I took out of Moto, right? I didn't want to do all that wheel tread, tire tread and things, okay? And then there's the Paintover. So that's it. It only has a couple of steps. So it's just you paint a little differently, right? You just maybe you use pads to create your cut lines as opposed to doing it all by hand, etc. Mm-hmm. And it's using probably more photography when you layer it back together. And I have another one here. Let's see. This one is like a loose. So this is a nice example of packaging, where I'm just worried about moving the elements I know I'm required to have, right? 2 front wheels, I need a spare front tire, a spare rear tire, 2 rear wheels. I have a mid-engine, I have lighting, and it's a one-person, vehicle. And so I get to, as long as I place those all in the right place, then when I draw and I model over the top, okay, I know that that's going to be driven by, it's going to work basically, functionally. And then now it's up to me to try and play around with the style without moving those hard points. So that would be like a block out in Moto, and then this would be a paint over in Photoshop, and then this would be going back to the 3D, looking at the Photoshop one to finish off the model a bit more, okay, and then we'd go and add some weathering. So now it's been driving around in this dusty environment, right? Look at the ground it's on. And so we just model it in tan, right, opaque, and throw it on top in Photoshop, and you just erase it where you don't want the dust. And so now it's kind of weathered and sitting in this environment. And we add some more graphics and things like that, and some cut lines. So if we go back to Steve, if you look on this one, you can see there's no cut lines on the door, right? And not there either. Right? So you can see the true model here, but then when you go back here, now look, there's a lot of cut lines that have been added, etc., because those are faster to paint than they are to model. Here's another example. There's the base render. There's my dirt pass, and then here's the paint over. So if you look at the back center there, you'll see a lot of cut lines show up from this to this. So yeah, that's you just have to sharpen up the way you render. I mean, if you know how to render photoreal objects, then you're good to go.
So then obviously the first step is having a very strong understanding of lighting, shading, and rendering.
Yeah.
What type of studies do you do to, well, now you're maintaining the skills, but before when you were learning them, what type of studies were you doing to build such a great understanding of lighting and rendering?
You know, we worked from observation, but at the same time with the explanation of the science and the physics behind it. And so putting those two together then allowed you to draw and paint not only, you know, matte surfaces, but reflective surfaces from your imagination. And that's the big challenge, right? Because if you're going to try and create something that the world has never seen before in a certain material, there's nothing you can go look at to, you know, exactly show you what is that thing going to be. So then you have to understand the physics and know what to go look for. And say, well, I have all these forms. These are all original forms, but I want them to be a shiny red paint, for instance. So if you understand the physics of reflectivity, then you can actually go out and do some visual research and pull some scrap and understand it from a physics standpoint. So then you know how to rebuild it and paint it on your original forms. So, I mean, it's like a deep topic, right? I just spent schoolism. I just did a 9-week or a 9-lesson course, which finishes in like 2 or 3 weeks on rendering reflective surfaces. And it's each lecture is 2 hours, so it's 18 hours of lecture on just rendering reflective surfaces. So it's not something you pick up overnight, but you can do it. I know, but it's not. But you can definitely do it, and you can start to do all that ray tracing in your brain, and you know, do it all yourself. It's fun once you get it.
So to me, it sounds like it begins, of course, with the understanding of the physics and the studies that you can combine together, but then almost as if you have a method of simulating it in your brain as you're drawing. Am I following you correctly?
Correct. And you're basically doing exactly what the computer's doing. So you're bouncing your line of sight around, the camera's line of sight, you're bouncing it around, you're plotting reflections with your perspective drawing skills. You're then adding a Fresnel effect, right, by layering in Photoshop and erasing those layers in the proper way to get the proper effect. So you're just recreating what you've observed in, you know, in the physical world when the physics have been explained to you. So I think it's observation coupled with explanation of what's happening in the real world and what's happening with the physics.
Now, obviously, with 3D rendering, a lot of those things are being simulated by the rendering engine. Has learning 3D art and rendering assisted you in painting with more accurate lighting and shading?
Yeah, I think so, actually. And what's really nice about it is that you can turn on and off the effect, right? So you can have a matte surface, and then you can, say, ramp up the Fresnel effect inside Modo, and you can observe what's happening almost real time in your preview window. And so I find that super beneficial. And then I get it, right, in my mind in Photoshop. I'm like, wait a minute, if I just have one layer where all my reflections are, and I could have changed the opacity, right, and then introduce the gradation for the Fresnel effect, I can get exactly what I'm doing inside Modo, inside Photoshop. So I think, and also and you know the scene that's around your object, so when you see things reflected into it, you know what's happening, where they came from, so you have a deeper understanding of the environment, and you place the light, so you understand the lighting. So yeah, I find it, yeah, it's very educational. In fact, I think it's maybe even a better way to teach traditional matte surface shading and rendering is by going into a 3D program and turning on and off those layers and ramping up those effects, right? Then I think it makes actually explaining the physics easier than looking at a photograph and trying to separate those different layers out.
So to paraphrase what you're saying, it begins with studies, moves on to understanding the physics, and then breaking up each part of lighting, rendering, and shading into individual pieces and stages so that you can better understand it.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, see, you should just answer from now on. We got 5 minutes left. You can take over. It's perfect.
If only I could just download all that information into my own matrix style and then share it. I absolutely would, but I think the only way to do that is to have as much experience as you've had in the design and entertainment industry. So I think that might actually be a good question that we can start closing off this last 5 minutes with. We have a lot of people here, and this actually plays off one question from one of the attendees, that the entertainment world and the design world is seeing a big change. There's a real boom in the interest in being an artist. There's schools popping up all over the place where you can go and you can learn about being a artist for entertainment. What do you see the future of the concept art world being?
Well, you know, I think it's going to become more mature. I mean, now it's actually something, and the reason you see all the schools is because the students want it, right? And it is a viable career option. Whereas in the past, it didn't exist when I graduated. So it wasn't even, you know, a career path you could really pursue easily. And, you know, it was like game models were done with 5 polygons. So, you know, nobody wanted to work in video games. It was the era of Pac-Man. So I think where it's going to go is it's kind of more of the same. Sorry, I was just trying to advance that and make it interesting. Here, I think I'll let this thing play at the end. These sci-fi suits.
And just a reminder,
automatically.
For anyone who is interested in more information on this, you can head to Scott Robertson's YouTube channel and you can watch a whole 58-minute video where he discusses a lot of these processes. And you can have the floor again, Scott.
So I just think it's more of the same. I think that the tools are going to make your ability to share the visions in your imagination easier. I don't think the process of the methodology is going to change that much, but I think the tools used to communicate the designs that you come up with are going to greatly change. And so I like to always stay current and try and stay on top of that and help to actually try and lead the way a little bit on helping to develop those tools, not only so I get to use them, but you know that it advances our own industry. And so I think you need to stay relevant, and that's always been the case, right? When markers came out and replaced watercolors, you needed to stay relevant. I mean, here were these things that you didn't take any time to dry, or when gouache came along as a way to do architectural illustrations instead of compare it to oil paintings, right? You can't really quickly do an oil painting, throw it under your arm, and run off to a presentation. And so same sort of thing. Photoshop then replaced markers and chalk and that sort of thing. It was much easier to render in Photoshop. And so I think you need to stay relevant, and as the tools advance, try to adopt them if they're appropriate for your genre, for your sector of what you're trying to design. And then always be creative about your process. Try to apply your design thinking to the way that you develop your ideas, as opposed to only thinking about designing the object. Think about how to design the object. I think you can come up with some creative solutions.
Well, I think that's a lot of good information for folks here to chew on about how to remain relevant as this industry is changing. And I want to thank you, Scott, for joining us today, and I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. Really, it's been an excellent session. Quite a few members here today. I do want to remind everyone before we close that registration for CGMA courses is currently closed, but it will open again on March 18th. So please visit cgma2dacademy.com to view current class options so that you can plan on signing up for the class or classes that best fit your needs. Again, we were speaking with Scott Robertson today. If you would like more information about Scott, you can head over to his website. If you could remind me the URL of your website, Scott?
Yeah, it's just draw through, spelled the normal way. In fact, I probably can jump to a slide here.
Perfect.
That's my YouTube thing. Let me go over here. There it is. All right.
Drawthrough.blogspot.com. And also
that's my blog. And I'd say my blog is the best because on the upper right of my blog, there's like 10 links to everything I have on the internet. So my Flickr channel, or my YouTube channel, my Flickr account, Facebook, which I run as a public site, so there's a lot. All the updates are going through Facebook and Twitter, of course, and my normal website, which I treat as kind of an archive of work. So, yeah, it's all there through the Blogspot. I think is the best way to find it all.
Yeah, so Scott has a lot of information. So if you're leaving this interview hungry for more, which I'm sure that you are, head over to his website, head over to his YouTube channel. There's a lot of great information there. So Scott, again, thank you so much for joining us, and attendees, thank you so much for being here today. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Oh, thank you very much. And hey, thanks for everybody for tuning in. It's a lot of fun.